lecture on the 21st century, or a second lecture on the 21st century. And today we're going to speak mostly of the power of images and information and the relationships between England and Russia on the current stretch of history. And but of course we're going to do to look back, to make some flashbacks as well. So I hope to devote these two lectures, I mean today and next time, which is going to be our final sort of last but one class. I hope to devote it to the 21st century and generally to the overall view of the relationships between Russia and England, because we know quite a lot of things about these relationships over history. So I think now what we could do is to make these links, sort of mental links between different events, and look at the whole picture in general, look at the trends maybe. So we've already looked at some of the spy stories, but we haven't looked at the newspapers and the image of Russia in the newspapers. And well, this slide here illustrates a mosaic because look, it's too easy to look at the different blocks of information as separate things. But it's what is the most valuable thing is to try the picture behind these blocks of information, or rather the picture that is constructed with the help of these blocks of information. And then we're going to see a picture, right? Instead of seeing separate blocks of mosaics. So if we look at well, the geographical position of our two countries, you'll see that they have no border to argue about. They have no direct intersection of interests. So we are too far, and that led some thinkers to believe that the power of Russia is what is called tellurocracy. That means the power over land mostly. And the type of power that Great Britain has is thalassocracy, from the Greek word for thalassa, the sea. That is the power over the sea. And like the bear doesn't fight with the whale, so Russia doesn't have any, and England shouldn't have any occasions to fight, because bears don't fight with whales. However, over history, as you know, that proved to be different. And well, it was also inevitably so, probably, because as you remember, we spoke about that these two empires, the British and the Russian empires, are by and large the two largest empires in the world. Although you know, I checked myself and I discovered that I'm partially wrong, because the biggest ever empire was the Mongol Empire. It was the biggest one, but it only lasted for several years, so it wasn't very long living. So the two relatively stable empires have been the British Empire, which is colored red, and then I spent some time coloring this map blue, just to illustrate, to show you the ratio between the sizes of the two countries, right? They are comparable, and that they indeed are the biggest countries in the world. One of them covering 1/6 of the Earth, which is Russia, and the other one is the empire of which the sun never set. Well, on the one hand, yes, because if it depends on what you understand by more difficult. Because look, controlling land and controlling overseas territories, it is more difficult for us who are here inlanders, you know. But for Britain, I don't know, because they are great sailors. So for them, the sea was, rather than being something that separated them from the colonies, was something that it was a bridge to the colonies. So it's difficult to say, but inevitably interests of these two big countries overlapped. However, as I told you last time, I believe that it's not a mirrored situation. So there has never been a situation in which Russia would be equally intent on harming England. Rather, the reverse has been the case. So England has, unfortunately, has always regarded Russia as its competitor and as a threat to its colonies, to its rich, and to its power. And therefore, well, sort of the initiative in this competition and the initiative in the confrontation has mostly been on the British side rather than on the Russian side. That doesn't mean that Russia didn't respond. Russia did, but generally this initiative has always come from the other side. And largely we can also see this now. So if you look at, well, we're going to speak about that later. But if you look now, our government was very, very reluctant to sort of oppose the West. It has always felt part of the West and wanted, as we Russians like to say, to be friends, right, with other countries. But unfortunately, this is not always possible when the other side doesn't want to be friends. So again, just to give you a glimpse and the idea of the sizes and of the general movement of territories. So this was the Russian Empire at the peak of its might in 1914. On this map, you see that Finland is Russian, Poland is Russian, and all these territories were Russian. And this is England, rather far, but look, just compare the size of the continent. This is Europe, right? This is Europe, and with all its history, with all its great, you know, ruins and everything, and philosophy and the great culture, just in terms of sheer geographical size, it is much, much smaller than Russia, and that is something which has always been one of the reasons for confrontation, is the mentality of a small country where everything is clear. It's like you live in a small flat, you understand where everything is. Then you come into a palace and then sort of you don't know how to combine these two things. Well, I'm going to speak about that next time, probably. So this was the country against which England tried to sort of work. And then we see what happens to it in the 20th century. There are parts of this country that are chipped away after the revolution, which is Poland, again, Finland, well, the two big parts, right? But still, the Soviet Union is quite close to the remaining parts of Europe. And of course, Europe here is much more fragmented, and new countries have appeared. Then what do we see here now is the next stage. It's after 1991, after the Soviet Union collapsed. And here we see the new independent countries: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, and this is no longer Russia, right? So sort of Russia keeps crumbling like a building, right? Keeps crumbling on the West. Moreover, what is new reality is that these countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, they are no longer just neutral countries. They are colored here because they are part of NATO. And NATO is an alliance which was formed to counterbalance the Soviet Union, which had military plans against the Soviet Union, which had the idea, well, you know, there's a French word, raison d'être. The reason for existing of NATO was to be, well, a military alliance against Russia. So when Russia, yeah, when was it established? NATO, 1949, I think. Yeah, after the Second World War. Yeah, sure. And now, well, after 1991, these countries all joined NATO. So it became part of the former Soviet Empire, Russian Empire, and then the Soviet Union became members of a hostile bloc. So, and then if we look at the Soviet Union here on this map, you will also see that, well, its borders are in the south, are very, very far south, right here. And then now let's compare it with the new map, and we see that Russia crumbled on the south as well, in the south as well, right? So lots and lots of parts of Russia, of the Russian Empire, became independent and sort of fell off the country. As I liked it, the way Leontiev put it in one of the videos that I showed you, that is a country which tore itself to pieces, cut itself to pieces. Well, and in 1991, that was largely peacefully. However, if we think of this general line of confrontation with the United Kingdom, we have to bear in mind that, well, Russia has always feared incursions and invasions from the west as well as from the east, right? Initially, it was the east, but then it was the west. Because if we look at the history of Western invasions into Russia, we'll see that there were quite a lot of them. Well, this is, I'm not taking any smaller ones or the earlier ones. Well, this is the time of troubles in Russia. And here we see these brown arrows which show you False Dmitry and the Polish armies marching onto Russia. Then in the north, the purple lines are Swedish troops making inroads into Russia. Then if we look at the 18th century, and this is Karl XII, the Swedish king, and we see his purple arrows also going inside Russia into what is now Ukraine. And at Poltava, there was this battle, right, with the Swedes. Then if we look at Napoleon, there is yet one more very big invasion from the West. Well, these slides are here just to illustrate how many times, big time, the Western armies, regardless of which country, have invaded Russia from the West. And this is Napoleon. Next slide is the First World War. And these red lines show you how far the German troops went into the Russian Empire, right, and what they controlled. And then finally, this slide shows us the territories controlled by the German armies in the Second World War. And yeah, well, these red territories were as far as the Germans went and occupied and controlled. So this all just shows you how, well, that strategically, Russia has and historically has feared the stability of its Western front, of its Western frontiers, Western border. Therefore, when Ukraine and Georgia held talks with NATO, and NATO invited them basically to join NATO, this could not but be regarded as a sort of a threat. And even so, Russia didn't act until very recently, when there were, well, de facto, there were very many troops of NATO countries in Ukraine. And well, I'm not going to speak of Ukraine today much, because I wanted to save it maybe for next time. Today I'm going to show you some other things. But generally, it is just to give us an idea of what the Russian geostrategic position is, right? And then, of course, why is it now, NATO, many people say, well, I've talked to many people and discussed that. Many people used to say, look, NATO has never been a threat to Russia. NATO didn't want to do anything to Russia. And in fact, they wouldn't. Even now, they are not entering a full-scale, confrontation with Russia. I mean, military confrontation. And then many people said, look, what the Russian government has done, instead of having NATO here. Now we have NATO here de facto, and Finland and Sweden joined NATO, which is, of course, true. But that doesn't mean that, well, that still doesn't mean that NATO isn't a hostile bloc, which it actually does prove. That it does prove that it is hostile. Because, again, if we look at the degree of confrontation, we'll see that this is a real sort of, they regard it as an existential war in a way. Well, anyway, why is also Russia so much concerned about the Western borders? Because, well, much of Russia is in the European part, and Moscow is here. So actually, if you, the Western maps, I didn't look for them yesterday, so I haven't found them. But maybe if I find them, I'll show you that, well, there are these maps which show you that depending on where you put, like enemies' missiles, you cover the whole of European Russia. And Ukraine was, of course, very important because it's also about the time of missiles. Nowadays, well, in the late 20th century, in the 21st century, the war was largely viewed as a war of missiles, of rockets. And of course, everybody counted how many miles they had to fly. And of course, the Russian anti-missile systems were only calibrated for a certain time of response. And of course, the closer you bring missiles, the shorter the time, the fewer the opportunities that you will intercept them. However, that will come later. Now, I just wanted again to summarize this history of confrontation between England and Russia. And well, maybe the milestones here would be these. Again, discounting the smaller episodes, and these would be the participation, or rather, well, the sort of trail in the assassination of Paul I, which is, of course, well, you remember the United States spoke of the Russian meddling in the US elections, the interfering in the home politics of the United States. Well, this was an example of outstanding meddling in the home Russian affairs and the home Russian politics. Yes, with the beginning of the 19th century, generally, or the end of the 18th century. Hello. Right, then the Russian English, well, the Crimean, oh no, the Russian-English War of 1807, 1812, I told you about it. That was a slow-burning war where there were not many casualties, except for the Russian Mediterranean squadron, which after which Russia effectively lost its Mediterranean fleet. Then the Great Game of 1804, 1885 in Central Asia, over Afghanistan, over Turkmenia, Uzbekistan, and the others, and of course between and Afghanistan. Then the next milestone is the political support that was given to Russian revolutionaries and in 1917, and then the intervention in 1918 to 21-22. Then right after the Second World War, there were the plans, the unthinkable, authored by Winston Churchill and Drapshot, then authored by the United States, which were plans for a military confrontation with the Soviet Union, and one of them being Drapshot. Just to remind you what it was the plan to bomb 300 Russian biggest cities with nuclear weapons, not just Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but 300 Russian cities. And only the invention of the Russian nuclear bomb prevented this plan. Then the Cold War of 1946, 1991. Well, the Cold War, we can regard it as a form of confrontation, of course, and this was between the English-speaking countries and Russia, and the USSR. And then now we see the new spiral of confrontation starting from 2007. 2007. So in general, this charts the sad story of opposition between England and Russia, which again, just what I wanted to say this once again so that people make no mistake. I'm much in favor of cooperation between England and Russia. I love England. I love the country. I love its people. I love its country, its culture. But of course, the politics is a different thing. I mean, I don't like the politics that the United Kingdom has pursued towards Russia. And if we look at the, well, some basics of international relations, we can see there are certain types of relations between countries. There can be action and interaction or context, the two main types of relations. And action can be of various types. It could be influence, it could be attack, it could be dependence. And various countries around the world, they follow these several modes of existence or of coexistence with other countries. And then the interaction of the context can be cooperation and competition. So these five main types of relationships have been in history of Russia, and well, now after this course, I'm sure that you will be able to give many examples of each one. One of the forms of action is influence. And this is what we're going to look at most today, because we're going to look not at the military actions, but rather this, what came to be called the soft power. The soft power. Joseph Nye was the author of this term, and he invented this term to oppose it mostly to military power, but not only. His idea was that soft power is not really confrontation at all. What he meant is that soft power is just the power of attractiveness. The attractiveness of a certain country's image that draws other countries into its sphere, or rather that encourages other countries to follow its lead. And so that means in increasing your influence without actually doing much. So just by weight of your own authority, by means of your own attractiveness, you sort of are friends with other people and you develop the sphere of international relations. However, it was frequently and has been frequently misinterpreted. And well, into this soft power, people have included things which are just not military means of influencing other countries. And the three spheres which Joseph Nye identified in soft power were culture, political views, and foreign policy, in this order. So he regarded culture as the most attractive thing. And what of course, I think he was driving at, because he was driving at the example of the United States, which did give examples of soft power when the whole world started to like jeans, to sing American songs, to watch American movies. And well, largely this was what he meant by soft power. People liked it, and people followed it. And there he's, well, right. But then he also said that what also matters is political values, that this culture is sort of trickles down into political values, and you must make your political values attractive to other people. So what he was driving at was, of course, freedom of choice, freedom of speech, democracy in the best ever understanding of this term, right? The ability of people to influence the political process, then the freedom of conscience, the freedom of press, human rights, things like that. Well, the things which are typical attractive values for people at the end of the 20th century. And then the last one is foreign policy. And foreign policy should reflect these two things and therefore be attractive to other people. However, in my presentation later, I'm going to sort of knowingly misinterpret Joseph Nye. So I'm going to look at the ways all these three things have been used by Britain and by the United States in their contacts with Russia. And I'm going to look at these things in this order because, well, foreign policy, political values, I'm going to look less at them. I'm going to look at culture more. So if we look at the foreign policy, we can see that one of the means to influence, bless you, one of the means to softly sort of influence other countries has been regime change. So that means you don't, you avoid sending troops, although sometimes, not in Russia. The United States has used military intervention, like special secret service operations, to overthrow regimes in other countries. But very often this was not military, or just very slightly supported by the military. And probably one of the earliest examples of this concerning Russia was the regime change in parts of Russia after the revolution of 1917. And these are some quotations from this book by Alexander Mikhailovich Romanov, the Grand Prince, the Grand Prince of the Romanov family. He survived the revolution, one of the few Romanovs who survived the revolution. And he left very interesting memoirs, autobiography, where he wrote about many insights because he was in the in Russia's politics for decades. So he shares some of the insights and some of the assessments of the policies. So these are quotations about what happened after the revolution. He was actually the one who went to the Paris Peace Conference and wanted to invite France and England to help with military might to the White Armies to crush the Bolsheviks. He wanted to invite the English and the French to come and help the Russians, the White Army. But this is something that he writes what happens after this. But then something strange happened. Instead of following the advice of the experts, the heads of state of the Allied powers adopted a policy that caused Russian officers and soldiers to experience profound disillusionment with our former allies and even to acknowledge that the Red Army was defending Russia's integrity from foreign encroachment. The British appeared in Baku and created the independent state of Azerbaijan with the goal of seizing Russian oil. Batumi became a free city under British protection, with a civilian governor overseeing the delivery of oil to England. Peace-loving Italians, for some reason, appeared in Tiflis and Tbilisi and helped establish an independent Georgia in the southern Caucasus, known for its manganese deposits. Around the same time, a small contingent of Americans and Japanese landed in Vladivostok, and British ships dropped anchor at Revel, Tallinn on the Baltic Sea, declaring the creation of independent states of Latvia and Estonia behind General Yudenich's army. In total, 9 independent states were established by the Allies on Russian territory in the spring of 1919, and the Romanians occupied Russian Bessarabia long before the relevant decision was made of the peace conference. The Russians were stunned. The behavior of our former allies left a disgusting impression on them. Apparently, the Allies are planning to turn Russia into a British colony, wrote Trotsky in one of his proclamations to the Red Army. Wasn't he right this time? Inspired by Sir Henry Dietering, the all-powerful chairman of the Royal Deutsche Shell Company, or simply following the old Israeli Beaconsfield program, the British Foreign Office showed daring intention to deal Russia a mortal blow by distributing the most prosperous Russian regions to the Allies and their vassals. The makers of European destinies apparently admired their own inventiveness. They hoped to kill both the Bolsheviks and the possibility of a revived, strong Russia with one blow. And then, of course, this regime change was later on developed, much developed, and then used in many other countries, not only in the former Soviet republics as well. Now, the next episode that I wanted to show you is the Iron Curtain speech by Winston Churchill, because we don't usually read it, and we don't know what he wrote in it. And that was a momentous speech, right? That marked, again, this was in a way soft power, right? In this case, the soft power of diplomacy, in which we still can feel the opposition to the Soviet Union. However, I also wanted to show you that he's not totally negative towards the Soviet Union in his speech, and this is something that I was surprised to read. He begins with inside the speech he says this: "A shadow has fallen upon the scene so lately, lighted by the Allied victory. Nobody knows what Soviet Russia and its Communist International Organization intends to do in the immediate future, or what are the limits, if any, to their expansive and proselytizing tendencies. I have a strong admiration and regard for the valiant Russian people and for my wartime comrade, Marshal Stalin. There is deep sympathy and goodwill in Britain, and I doubt not here in the United States also, towards the peoples of all the Russia, and a resolve to persevere through many differences and rebuffs in establishing lasting friendships. But I understand the Russian need to be secure on her western frontiers by the removal of all possibility of German aggression." And he actually, here he acknowledges that we understand the Russian need to be secure on her western frontier. But here he only mentions the German aggression. "We welcome Russia to her rightful place among the leading nations of the world. We welcome her flag upon the seas. Above all, we welcome, or should welcome, constant, frequent, and growing contacts between the Russian people and our own people on both sides of the Atlantic. It is my duty, however, for I am sure you would wish me to state the facts as I see them to you. It is my duty to place before you certain facts about the present position in Europe." And then he comes to the Iron Curtain part of the speech. "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent." And then I come to the crux of what I have traveled here to say. "Neither the sure prevention of war, nor the continuous rise of world organization will be gained without what I have called the fraternal association of the English-speaking peoples. This means a special relationship between the British Commonwealth and Empire and the United States of America." And here he speaks of the necessity for them, for the English-speaking peoples, to unite, to oppose Russia. So in a way, this creation of this unity, of this alliance against Russia, unfortunately played the major role in the formation of NATO. And then he continues, and I think these are interesting words that give us an opportunity to think of the fate of the world and in the 20th century. "The state of the world, ladies and gentlemen, requires a new unity in Europe, from which no nation should be permanently outcast." And by this he means NATO. Well, what would become NATO. "Let no man underrate the abiding power of the British Empire and Commonwealth." And then this is the end of his speech. "If we adhere faithfully to the Charter of the United Nations and walk forward in sedate and sober strength, seeking no one's land or treasure, seeking to lay no arbitrary control upon the thoughts of men, if all British moral and material forces and convictions are joined with your own in fraternal association, the high roads of the future will be clear, not only for our time, but for a century to come." So, and this is what President Trump now calls peace through strength, right? Because their idea is, if we're the strongest, there will be peace, because we will be able, well, to dictate to everyone else what we want. And this will be good. It's the same logic that they had when colonizing the other countries. If we're strong enough, we'll be able to bring civilization to the other corners of the world, and there will be peace. And we'll prosper as well, of course. That's something that they fail to mention all the time. And of course, there are some interesting words here, and I think that it could have been so if people in the West follow Churchill's advice here. If we don't seek anyone's land or treasure, in the deeper sense of the word, if they hadn't sought, if they hadn't tried to take anyone's land or treasure by influence in this case, to lay no arbitrary control upon the thoughts of men, not to make people think only in one particular manner, then I think everything would have been good. But the tragedy is that the Western Bloc didn't follow Churchill's own rules. They did try to control other people's land and treasures, to control other people's thoughts, and to enter this ideological duel with the Soviet Union. And that unfortunately led to the confrontation in the Cold War. And this is the Commonwealth of the former British Empire. So what is also important is that Britain, after its empire disintegrated, on the one hand, well, it lost a lot of its power. On the other hand, they retained a lot of its power in newly independent states, right? Unlike, well, rather similar to Russia, but in a way unlike Russia, their Commonwealth is still largely loyal to the British metropolis. They're still largely loyal to the UK. And in a way, they support British decisions, they support British initiatives on the world stage, which, of course, is a factor in geopolitics. One more document, or rather one more figure that I wanted to share with you is Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the advisor to President Carter in the 20th century, and who later on in 1997 wrote the book The Grand Chessboard, Великая шахматная доска. And this is what is usually understood by geopolitics, in which he lay out his vision for what geopolitics are and how the world should be controlled. Because look, what is 1997? It's the peak of the American power around the world. This is the peak of America's might, when the Soviet Union has collapsed. It has not only collapsed, but it broke into many pieces. Who were struggling in the 1990s, well, Russia was in a poor state, and so were the other Soviet republics. That was poverty much beyond even the standards of the Soviet Union. Then, no, China was not as powerful as it is yet. And China was still a very emerging power. So it's the peak of American domination around the world. People write books like The End of History by Fukuyama. Francis Fukuyama writes the book The End of History, speaks of the end of history, because he says, from now on, we're going only to see prosperity around the world. Globalization will lead to only improvement of people's lives around the world. And that was the time when actually the United States did have unprecedented opportunities to mold, to shape the world the way they wanted. And even in Russia, well, many people admit that had the United States behaved in a wiser manner, they would have got Russia on its side as its ally. Well, we saw that in the film that I showed you yesterday. Putin was there. Not only Yeltsin, Putin was there to go on and cooperate with the United States and well, even join NATO. Well, we saw this episode. However, the people in the US government whose opinion dominated in the establishment were the hardliners. And they thought, well, they thought of the collapse of the Soviet Union not as a lucky gift from history, but rather as their own merit, as the reward. They said, we did it. We broke the Soviet Union. Now we have to push it on so that it never sort of becomes an empire. And Zbigniew Brzezinski was among those hardliners, the hawks, who was somebody who advocated for and promoted this hardline view. And he was one of those people who authored the enlargement of NATO towards the Soviet Union. Sort of but this is only natural. This is natural, but not very wise. What is natural is that there's, since antiquity, there was this saying, "Woe to the defeated, горе побежденному." So somebody who loses has to accept and to swallow whatever is given to him. So they thought that, well, that's it. Russia has to swallow whatever the United States does. And well, if we look at what he wrote, these are quotations from Wikipedia. I'm not giving you I will only give you one quotation from the book itself. Regarding the landmass of Eurasia as the center of global power, Brzezinski sets out to formulate a Eurasian geostrategy for the United States. In particular, he writes that no Eurasian challenger should emerge that can dominate Eurasia, and thus also challenge US global preeminence. So this book about the geopolitics, the grand chessboard, is about how to secure the US preeminence, its domination around the world, how to prevent other countries from becoming so strong that in any future they're going to oppose, that they could theoretically oppose the United States in Eurasia. And what is also, sometimes it's also the role of personality in history. Zbigniew Brzezinski was a Pole. He was a Polish man. And as we know, the relationships between Poland and Russia in the last 2 centuries and the last even 4 centuries have not been all sunshine. So Zbigniew Brzezinski, unfortunately, was one of those Polish people who was a Russophobe and strongly anti-Russian. Then the ultimate objective of American policy should be benign, good, and visionary, to shape a truly cooperative global community in keeping with long-range trends and with the fundamental interests of humankind. But in the meantime, it is imperative that no Eurasian challenger emerges capable of dominating Eurasia and thus also challenging America. This is a quotation from his book about Ukraine, and this is a much quoted, these are much quoted words by Brzezinski. Ukraine and you an important space on the Eurasian chessboard is a geopolitical pivot. Pivot is a C1 probably word, which means a focal point around which many things rotate. Because its very existence as an independent country helps to transform Russia. Without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be a Eurasian empire. So he sees Ukraine instrumental in keeping Russia in the limits, from preventing Russia from emerging as a big power. And it's he actually who writes about countries as pieces on the chessboard. To him, Ukraine, Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, Turkey are no more than chess pieces on the chessboard of which the player is the United States, which basically, this metaphor shows that in his view, the United States has all the rights to move these chess pieces on the board, to sacrifice some of them in order to gain some advantages for the game in general. And in a way, this grand chessboard, of course, continues the metaphor of the great game between Russia and England. And this is the one, again, from Wikipedia about this book, The Grand Chessboard. David C. Hendrickson, in his article in Foreign Affairs in 1997, saw the core of the book as the ambitious strategy of NATO to move eastward to Ukraine's Russian border and vigorously support the newly independent republics of Central Asia and the Caucasus. So that was the strategy of squeezing Russia on the west and on the south, sort of continuing to harass Russia all the time so that Russia has no time, no wish, no will, and no resources to become stronger. And well, frankly speaking, it is not only the foreign influence. Of course, it aroused a response in the Soviet Union and then in Russia, especially in the late Soviet Union. Again, if you remember a quotation or the words that was said by Posner in the video that we watched last time, he said that in the late Soviet Union, the government was anti-American. The grassroots were very much pro-American. People did love the United States. People did support this friendship between the United States and the Soviet Union. Why? Part of the reason was the soft power, the one that we spoke about earlier. This influence of culture, the influence of values. The Russian people these people in the Soviet Union regarded the politics of the United States as legitimate and the values as high. They like the idea of democracy. They like the idea of freedom of speech, and what they also liked is the abundance, the prosperity. Because the 80s in the Soviet Union, not the 70s, but the 80s in the Soviet Union were really a bleak time in terms of the economy. And of course, if you compare the pictures between the 1980s in the Soviet Union and between the 1980s in the United States, you could think that those were two different planets with all those, supermarkets and everything. And this is a quotation by Kozyrev. Kozyrev was the foreign minister of the Soviet Union and then of the new Russia. And this is what he said: Moscow doesn't have national interests, only the general, the interests of humanity in general. And it was he who actually gave everything to what the United States politicians and diplomatists wanted from the Soviet Union. He was called the Mr. Yes, because he would always reply yes to everything that came from the United States. But what transformed his mind, and this is a very important thing, what transformed the mind of Andrei Vladimirovich Kozyrev in 1975, a long time before he became the foreign minister, while he was still a young Soviet diplomatist, he visited the United States for the first time. When he got into the food supermarket, into the grocery supermarket, with its unseen in the Soviet Union abundance, in his own words, it was a shocker for him. It was such a strong shock for him that overnight he turned from a member of the Communist Party and a Soviet diplomatist into somebody who supported the American way of life and Western democracy in the Soviet Union. And this is what soft power is: when you dislike the picture and you voluntarily follow the lead. And of course, this led then later, it wasn't only Kozyrev who thought like that. Many people in those days thought like that. And that led to 1991 and to the collapse of the Soviet Union and everything else that followed. And unfortunately for Russia, this admiration with the United States didn't work well. It didn't. Although maybe the values and the example were good. Nobody says that abundance in supermarkets and freedom of speech are bad things. No, they're good things. But unfortunately, geopolitically and politically, it doesn't always work like that. When you just accept the right ideas and try to implement them in your own country, regardless of anything, that doesn't have to work well. Now let's look at at the second point, and these are the political values. And Joseph and I spoke of political values as a factor in the soft power when the politics of some countries regarded by others as legitimate and having moral authority. So, for example, after 2022, the foreign policy of Russia was seen as illegitimate and having no moral authority, and therefore aroused this response in Western Europe and Eastern Europe as well. But when the same things were done well, not the same, but even worse things were done before. They were regarded by many as legitimate and having moral weight. Well, if we look at the war in Iraq, and if you look at what the American magazines would write about this, you will see how that invasion into a country which is so far from the United States and so far from their strategic interests and so far from their history was and how it was regarded by other nations, that was regarded as a necessity, as bringing peace, democracy, and stability into the Middle East to destroy a threat to civilization, which was this tyrannical, as they said, regime of Saddam Hussein. This is what they write: a heart-rending but necessary war. So a war which is a sad necessity. Why war would be justified? Well, look at this. When mom goes to war, isn't it such a nice way to put it, to humanize war? Well, there it is. The person of the year, the American soldier, one who brings peace, stability, and democracy to Central Asia, to Iraq. Why America must stay, building a new Iraq. Yeah. How to win the peace. And here you see an American female soldier and an Iraqi probably who is kissing her. Please stay, the American soldier. We want you in Iraq because you have liberated us from the dictator. How to Win Peace by Fareed Zakaria. But if we look, and again, this is a screenshot from Wikipedia about the losses of Iraqis in the Iraqi war. So up to 500,000, or by some estimates, it was 1 million Iraqis, most of whom were civilians, not the military, who died in this war. 500,000 people for a country to control the oil. But this is seen as legitimate. This is seen as having moral authority because it is about spreading the right political values, about spreading democracy and freedom of speech. So unfortunately, this didn't work the way Joseph Nye wanted it to look. Well, he only described it, to be honest. Well, he didn't author this politics. He only described it. But unfortunately, as we see, these political values are something which is manipulative, which is only declared, but which is not implemented. And finally, let's speak of culture. There is a long-standing and ancient piece of wisdom. If you want to defeat an enemy, bring up its child, bring up its children, and then you'll defeat him. And this works only so well in today's world. And we can say that this American influence, although we can admire Hollywood and we admire the American dream, we all admire the idea of good cinematography, of good cinema, of prosperity for most people. We admire the idea of freedom of speech and democracy and everything. But the way it has been used in the past 30 years has been manipulative rather than, so people swallowed it because that was such a nice idea, because it is genuinely attractive. But unfortunately with it came the new allegiances, allegiance as, I hope I'm right in saying this word. Came the new loyalties of people to, well, political loyalties of people. Along with the cultural values, people also swallow the political loyalty. So where does it work? In which spheres of culture does it work? Everywhere. This is just a chart showing you the different spheres of culture. It's agriculture, it's industry, crafts, jewelry, museums, theater, ballet, music, visual arts, architecture, cinema, literature, education, norms and values. And it's actually norms and values which govern the rest of this matrix. Because inside every square in this chart are the norms and values. And there's also the language. Well, if we look at this is just to illustrate you from everyday life how far this influence and can influence the country. If you look at these, this sign on the door on Moscow metro trains, you'll see that there are two signs, "Не прислоняйся" and "Do not lean on door." And that was, bless you, that was introduced here in Russia in the 21st century. Although before that there was this sign. Do you still remember these signs on the doors? Yeah? Some of you may remember, some of you may not. But then there were these new ones. Why? Because England became the dominant language, became the one international language, as much as Zbigniew Brzezinski wanted it to be, the global preeminence of the United States. And Russia was influenced by that. We also introduced that into the country. Also, look at this, how this is no secret that there has been a massive English influence on the Russian language as well. And just to give you a few examples, how the Russian words were used. For example, the word challenge, right? The Russian word vizov had no, I hope you're reading this while I'm speaking, because I'm not going to read this. That people started using the words as calques from English, which is not bad. I'm not saying this is bad. I'm just giving you the examples of influence, right? Like, for example, the word challenge came to be used in a new semantic function. Then, again, can you identify the influence of English in these phrases? Which of the words don't sound very Russian to you? The last one. Really? Я отнесся к нему лояльно. Loyal, this is English. It wasn't like that before the 90s in the Russian language. And what is about aggressivный макияж? That now it sounds okay, but this is a neologism. Yeah, макияж is, of course, but the use of the word aggressive, that's an influence from English. Yes.
Series about Chernobyl, and in the translation they use the word permanent. Yes, and it was actually not relevant at that time. So it was like actual mistake.
All right.
It's like loyalty.
Yeah. Well, but it also reflects the trends in the language, right? It reflects the trends in the language. Right? Or, for example, what about the top phrase? Успешные люди. People could not be successful before the 90s. That's a new collocation. Now you're used to that, but that's a new collocation. People could not be successful. Well, I mean, the collocation was not possible. People could be successful, but there was no such collocation. That's the influence of English. And with this language also came values and norms and everything. Nowadays, there is this sphere of research which is called imagology, which studies the stereotypes, the images and myths of other countries in some particular language. So that could be the image of England in Russian culture, which explores the stereotypes of Russians about the English, the images of England and the English in the Russian mentality, and myths about England and the English and Russian mentality. And of course, what contributes to the image of the country? Largely it is literature and the media. Literature and the media. They create the image of some particular country. So for example, we in the media or in literature, at the beginning of the 19th century, Marquis de Custine, a French traveler, came to Russia, wrote his travelogue about Russia, and that was such a hostile and such a negative travelogue of Russia that it became one of the bases for this, again, very negative Russian image in Europe in the 19th century. Whereas, on the other hand, when John Reed came to Russia during the revolution, the October Revolution of 1917, he later wrote a book, 10 Days That Shook the World. And that was a famous book which tried to show the right side that the Bolsheviks were on. It tried to show you how good the Bolsheviks were. And that, of course, played an important role in creating a good image of the Soviet Union abroad. Now, if we think of literature, there are two main sections of literature, and these are fiction and non-fiction, documentaries, travelogues, and other things like that. And if we think of conscious political policies in this sphere, it is the proliferating the right narratives. Proliferating the right narratives. What does it mean to proliferate? To make them more, right? To make more of the right narratives and censor the wrong narratives. So this is the general policy when it comes to regulating the press. So of course, it doesn't mean that all literature is regulated, but it means that there are, of course, government authorities in the UK and in the United States which sort of promote various things, right? They promote the right narratives and they try to silence or censor the wrong narratives. And of course, these are the ethical inferences, the ethical conclusions, defining the good and the bad, which in its turn creates the images and evokes emotions. This is the aim of literature, to create images and to evoke emotions. And even when the authors don't have it as their goal, like to evoke any emotions or to set the goals, they do it, whether they want it or not. Well, for example, this is a quotation from the book A People Passing Route by Anthony Cross, where he writes of the 16th century. Among the earliest and most influential Elizabethan accounts of Russia were those collected and published by Richard Hakluyt in 2 editions at the end of the 16th century. But to other publications appearing before Hakluyt, but then included by him in a shortened form, were influential in establishing a largely negative perception of Russia that extended way beyond intense cold and ubiquitous bears to religious obscurantism, tyrannical rule, and almost willful ignorance. And these were the foundations of the negative image of Russia, which were laid in the 16th century, and which later on traveled from century to century. In the 20th century, we see this again, Kipling, and this is a poem. This is not any political thing. He writes a poem, The Truth of the Bear, Перемирие с медведем. And I gave you the Russian translation, where, well, the plot of the poem is that the white man, the Englishman, met a bear, and he was in confrontation, but then he decided to make a truce with the bear, перемирие, temporary peace with the bear, to which the bear responded by trying to kill the white man. So the moral of this poem is never, never make a truce with the bear, even though he walks like us, even though he looks like, well, even though he looks like a human, he's not. I think you can appreciate the racist ring to this poem. Russia is a bear. It looks like people. It looks like Western Europeans. It walks on two legs, on 2 feet, like a Western European. But it's not. It's a bear. So never ever trust the bear. Never ever trust Russia. This is what he wants to say. And this is just illustrated one of the many cartoons and caricatures at Russia in the English press. Now, if we look at the 20th century, we see that the image of an enemy was shaped in fiction, among other things. And for example, in 1923, at that time, the genre of anti-utopias was popular.
So the Battle of London, the Battle for London, tells you about an anti-utopia. The Red Army, the Bolsheviks, attack London, and they are protecting London against the hordes of Russian barbarians. And then you can appreciate, and you can even guess what the next book is about. Korniets, right? That's again an anti-utopia about the Russian invasion. And then there were several books called Red, and all of them this sort of anti-utopian. The Red Tomorrow, the Red Lady, the Red Radio, the Red End, the Red Square. Yeah, Слепящая тьма. So this I didn't put the originals here. Then of course George Orwell's most famous books, 1984 and The Animal Farm, are about the Soviet Union. Even though in describing the totalitarian state, he used the practices of the BBC, but still, this book is about the Soviet Union. That's he tried to show what the Soviet Union is, could become. And then I was surprised to find out that the Lord of the Rings, not the Lord of the Rings, sorry, The Lord of the Flies by Golding is also an anti-utopia, which gives you an idea of this Cold War in a way, because the baddies in the Lord of the is it the Lord of the Flies, right? Are the prototypes. The prototypes for them were the Soviet Union. It was the Soviet Union for the prototype for the baddies. And then in the 90s, you have other things which are also, they're more about Russia as the opponent in the Cold War. It's more about spies, about these spy games. But again, it is the opponent who is strong, who is clever, but it is still an opponent. So when you just read a novel, when you just read a detective, subconsciously you swallow the idea that, well, Russia is the other. Russia is different. Russia is the enemy. And then in the 90s, the focus and the sort of parts of this image of Russia changed. It was no longer dangerous. It was pitiful. It was degraded. It was barbarian. For example, The Snowdrops by Edward Miller is it uses the slang word in Russian, подснежники. Do you know what подснежники in Russian means as a slang in the police slang? They are the dead bodies which emerge from under the snow after the snow melts in spring. So yeah, this is more about about Russia struggling in the 90s, about the poverty, about the the pitiful conditions in which Russians are. And now if we look at, I just made pictures and I also borrowed some pictures from a colleague of mine about the latest. Just look at the titles. I'm not going to comment on this. Just look at the titles of those books which are about Russia. Nothing is true and everything is possible. The surreal heart of the new Russia. Peter Pomerantsev. Make Russia great again. A novel. Putin's people. From Russia with blood. The Kremlin's ruthless assassination program and Vladimir Putin's secret war on the West. New Tsar, the rise and reign of Vladimir Putin, Putinomics, power and money in resurgent Russia. Who lost Russia? How the world entered a new Cold War. Trump, Putin, collusion, Sgovor. How Russia helped Trump win the White House. The Putin Corporation, how to poison elections. And this is again the hints about Russia poisoning people abroad. A very expensive poison, the definitive story of the murder of Litvinenko and Russia's war with the West. Strawman, Vladimir Putin and the struggle for Russia. Orders to kill, that's about allegedly Putin killing the opposition here in Russia. The new autocracy, information, politics, and policy in Putin's Russia. the Putin mystique inside Russia's power cult. Russia and the New World Disorder. Once upon a time in Russia, the rise of the oligarchs. Yeah. Black Wind, White Snow, the rise of Russia's new nationalism. And the majority of books about Russia are like these. It's not that these are just a drop in the ocean and many more good books are about Russia. No, these are the majority of books about Russia. And now I think even those people who thought that maybe Russia did something, if you just see the sheer amount of books about poisoning, about that, you just see that this is a paranoia. This is a paranoia. But unfortunately, this is this paranoid vision of Russia that people in the Anglosphere have to consume. And at this point, let us take a break, and I'll finish. I have a very short section of this lecture left, and I'll finish it in our next class.